You are listening to Level Up Your Gaming Podcast, episode 112, Understanding New Players. In today's episode, I talk about understanding new players and their motivations. I discuss a recent conversation with a new player that illuminated what motivates new players to me. If you'd like to participate in the discussion or leave us feedback, you can contact us at levelupyourgamingpodcast@gmail.com or find us on Facebook at facebook.com/levelupyourgaming. If you like the content and want to hear more of the show, subscribing will ensure you don't miss an episode. New episodes come out almost every Wednesday. Also, please review, tell a friend about the podcast, or share with your gaming group. Now sit back and enjoy the episode. Welcome into the Level Up Your Gaming Podcast. My name is Aaron. So today we're going to be talking about understanding new players. And before I do, I'm going to bring you the updates for the show. So one of the things I've been talking about is getting a rotating co-host in here. Talk to my other friends. People who I'll probably bring on the show on a semi-regular basis will be Tom. He is an experienced GM. I gamed with him. He's my Thursday night group. I've got Josh. Josh is a friend of ours that I met through one of the other guys I game with, which is Ken. Ken will also be on the show too. But both Josh and Ken are both experienced GMs and players. They've told myriad of different stories. They also do D&D 5e, so it should give you more of a that perspective to this podcast here. So I'm excited to bring them into this as well. And then I also have Josh's wife, Lori, who I'm going to bring into the podcast. And Lori, she might not be a semi-regular guest, but Lori is a new player. And so I feel like bringing in her experience and her perspective into these episodes would probably be really good. And actually, she was sort of the one who inspired this episode. So, we'll probably still talk about some of the things I talked about in this episode, but we'll do it in more of a long format back and forth with Lori. But I'm excited to bring all of them in. They all have expressed interest in doing this, probably doing some things with Zoom. You'll probably have 1 to 2 more episodes with just me solo. Tom has given me some topics to discuss and that he would like to maybe talk about, and we'll start adding them in, and so you won't just have Aaron talking on for 30 minutes. Although I hope you do enjoy that, because this podcast will have a bunch of that going forward. Also, our group is going to start gaming again next week. We were supposed to meet up this week to do Jared's game, and unfortunately, Brian and his wife were sick, so last minute game got called, and I'm like, okay, well, I guess we'll meet up next week. So barring any other problems, we'll meet up next week. And then I've been doing more work on my game, and I'm also in the process of working on some collaborations with other podcasts. They'll be coming out later this year. We had already had something planned with Jared and us to do something with another podcast. But with Jared having to come out of the podcast and fall off the podcast, I was thankfully the other guys that we were collaborating with said, "Hey, no, we totally understand. We're still up for doing something." So I look really forward to bringing you that later this year. Stay tuned for it. It's going to be great. But anyways, that's all for the updates there. We're going to go on to the main topic, and once again, that is understanding new players. And so I ended up going over to our friends Josh and Lori's last weekend, and because we weren't doing game, and I sat down with them and I was talking with them, about various different things, but we were talking about their games in general. So Josh and Ken both play in a Tuesday night game. In addition, Josh runs a Thursday night game for all the friend group over there. And the table consists of it's 5 players, but the table is 4 brand new players who never had played D&D prior to this. And then there's Ken. And Ken is without a doubt the most experienced player in the group. And so, and then Josh is a very experienced DM, but he's dealing with obviously 4 new players. Some people who have never played, some people who, when they started, probably didn't really want to play the game, but they were playing for their now wife. So it's a very interesting dynamic for the group there. And they were doing it in person and then the pandemic hit, and I know this is good. That's over a 2-year stretch there. They actually were they don't game every week, so they're not gaming for probably combined time and experience playing the game. I'd say they probably all have about a year of experience playing the game, which is a long time. It's a good time to kind of understand how you feel about the hobby as a whole, and maybe start to form some opinions of the hobby as a whole. But the game spawned and started off of Ken ran a game for Hero Quest, and Hero Quest is like D&D. It's like the Miller light beer of D&D. It effectively is D&D. If you're familiar with it, I think it's like a board game from like the 80s or something like that. But you generate tiled maps, and then the heroes dive into a dungeon, and you go through it. The damage is very simple. The rules are very simple. There's no spot checks, anything crazy like that. The character sheets are literally just like a little index card. It's got 2 stats on it, and that's basically all there is to it. But it's an interesting little thing. It's primarily focused around the combat. Ken gave it a little bit of flair and added some story to it, but it was totally combat based, and it was interesting, to say the least. I played a little bit with them through some of it, and what they did is, because that was the kind of dip your toe into the D&D waters, they elevated that game to become their D&D 5e game. And so Ken, I think, ran a module for D&D 5e, and everybody created characters for it. Josh helped. Now, Josh is, I would say, kind of the leader in the pack with wanting to play D&D. He's been looking for a group, and so to have his wife and then these other friends that they see every week, it makes it easy to do and be with that group. But anyway, so the pandemic happened, and they moved to a fully remote game. They set up things in Foundry and Discord, and we've talked myriad times on how to do a remote game. They use the tools that are available to them. And then what ended up happening is they had to move it off of Saturday nights, because Saturday nights they would tend to meet in person. This is like a year after the pandemic started, and things started to change, and they started to meet in person, but they didn't want to game; they just wanted to hang out, and so they moved their game to Sunday nights. And the problem is that Sunday nights for a lot of people in the group meant that Monday's your first work day, you're off on Sunday. That wasn't exclusive to everybody in the group, but it was kind of the case. So, and then Lori has 2 kids. And so, I mean, there's a lot of factors that make people tired, and it becomes hard to sort of work yourself into, the work week and get yourself decompressed and ready to go for the next day, which was actually part of the conversation that I had with Lori, because I was talking about it and I was asking, hey, what are your motivations in the game? And, what do you like about the game? Because Josh expressed that, it's hard to get everybody together. Nobody really remembers what we did in the week prior, in the last session, because the last session could be 2 weeks. It could be, a month out. So there's a very low inconsistency, and Josh does give feedback and let them kind of know what they're doing. But also, he said that, the engagement is that, nobody wanted to create backstories, and nobody wanted to do all this and all that. And the first thing I thought of was KYP. Know your players. So, what do the players like? And I think what Josh wanted from the group was players who are a little bit more experienced, who are going to give him more to work with. And what he has is he's got players that are brand new to the game that are still, they were in love with the idea of, swinging the sword, combat in the dungeons, rocking enemies and just destroying them. And he's kind of getting this I would say, a bit of an awakening here in that his players don't seem to line up exactly with where he wants to go with everything. Maybe they're not picking up what he's throwing down, and I'm like, maybe your story isn't simplistic enough. I mean, again, you're still dealing with relatively new players, and one of the things that you don't want to have happen when you're dealing with players this new, especially if they enjoy the hobby or they enjoy parts of the hobby, is that you don't want to turn them off by presenting something, I guess, that's more complex. I'm not saying that that your story has to be simple, but I would hate for you to be like, I'm this elite gamer and my players are not living up to my expectations, and you're dealing with people who are learning how to do the hobby. They've got to learn and be able to engage with stuff. So I was asking, so my initial thought was, okay, well, let's go KYP. Let's start asking Lori, and let's start saying, what do you like about the game? And so I said, what's going on in the game? And she's like, I got no idea what's going on in the game. And I'm like, all right, off to a great start. So, and that's also a product of the fact that they haven't gamed in like 3 weeks. But I'm like, what is your character doing? What's the motivation for your character? I'm asking her all these things that I would ask any, normal player in a game. And, she's just like, I think my players, like my characters from like a desert or something like that, just very like, I don't think that she never built a backstory for it. So Josh did it on her behalf, which I would highly suggest you avoid if you're a GM out there. It's probably something you shouldn't do, or you should sit down with them and kind of just do a quick talk through on general points about their backstory. But his whole motivation was to spotlight the players based on their backstories. And when you're dealing with the new players, if they are unwilling or don't want to write a backstory, and I mean, I'm the same way. I don't like writing backstories. We've talked about on this podcast several times how much I dislike backstories in general. I'm more like, tell me the specifications of the character, or that I'm going to be doing, and I'm going to get in the cockpit. I'm going to drive that character. I'm going to let you know his backstory. I don't need to write you a synopsis of what happened. And, we've talked about maybe just giving some bullet points of things that the GM could use, but he really wants to have a more heavily involved connection to backstory. And if he wrote it for her, obviously that's going to cause a problem because it's something that she didn't care about to begin with. So she had no motivation to write it, and he wants there to be motivation driven from the backstory, and she just doesn't care. And so I was like, wow, that's interesting. And I tried to kind of probe her on some different like areas. I'm like, based on how the game's going, like, what do you feel your motivations are? And she's like, well, I just don't feel like the game's about me at all. And or that like nothing revolves around me. And she's like, I just I'm totally disengaged from these things, and on and on and on. And I'm like, wow, that's really interesting, because I have such a passion for the hobby, in that I kept asking her, like, what drives you? What's your motivation? All this stuff. And what I was missing, because I don't play with new players, is that I forgot how somebody who's brand new to the hobby hasn't developed that muscle for probably building the character, motivation beyond, I like to go out and fight things. And that's what she likes to do. That's one of her primary motivations in the hobby, is she likes to fight things. And I was like, gee, we started with Hero Quest. They started with Hero Quest. And, she just wants to fight things. So I'm like, that makes sense. So, we've talked about on this podcast, how do you take that? How do you expand upon bringing someone who just wants to come into the table and fight things, because the Level Up Your Gaming podcast, and how do you level them up to want to engage with different parts of the story? Well, I'm like, you got to make that story fit around her, but you got to sort of find that motivation. You got to feel it out. And she actually had some interesting things in that, which was like, she's like, I don't always know if we're supposed to fight
the thing that's in front of us. But she's like, nobody says anything in Discord. And so it sounds like there's a lot of dead air in the group as well, which makes it tough to make decisions about where to go and what to do. And I don't think that she would, in terms of gravitating towards a spot within the group, I don't think she wants to sit in the leader spot. But she also doesn't want the game to stagnate and go nowhere. And it was just an interesting kind of back and forth. And like I said, I don't play with new players. I play with Brian and Jared, and it was like just mind blowing to realize I'm like, well, we actually got a comment like this on one of our YouTube videos, and I was like, interesting. Sometimes people just want to sit around and swing swords and roll some dice, and that is primarily her motivation. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna guess that a lot of the people who do this hobby, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, go into the hobby to roll the dice and use the powers and fight the combats. So, what is the right fit for that new player to make sure that you give them what they want, okay, which is, again, probably heavy combats, meaning every night you're going to have a combat, or I would doubt that you'd have two because they can take so long depending on how they're structured. And what you have to do is you have to interlace some story around that and hope that you can hit some of the things that motivate and connect that player to the game and connect that player to the rest of the group. It sounds like of the people who are in there, Ken is the most connected to the story and wants to find out more stuff. And our friend Ashley is also very connected to story, and it seems like Josh is trying to kind of feed into that there. And then Ashley's husband, Paul, is playing a character as well, and there's an interesting backstory that goes with it. And but Josh keeps throwing guys who are coming after him because he was a gladiator who earned his freedom. And unfortunately, Paul's not, grabbing the bait to go investigate things beyond the attacks. He's just like, crazy guy is attacking me again. Like, it's just kind of interesting as I kind of sit through and hear some of the pain points of this story, and maybe like what he's struggling with as a GM, but also maybe what the players are struggling with as well. And so the thing that I recommended to him, and what I would recommend to you, is that, we've talked about it before on the show, you got to make everything that you do in your game probably 2 steps stupider, or you have to have the 3 solution rule or 5 solution rule, whatever you want to implement there. But there's got to be a lot of ways for your players to get through the end of it. And if your players are new and your players, don't really know what they're doing, it's not unfair and unkind to kind of walk them to the next part of the story. And a lot of groups like that. Okay. And I mean, I'm reminded of a time when I played with Jared's other group that he would play with on, I think, Friday nights from time to time. And I mean, those guys were just heavy combat junkies, power gamers through and through. And they loved just kind of being walked through stuff. Jared ran a Scion game, which is, effectively demigods. And, you have like these mega attributes. If you've ever played, the other equivalent would be like Aberrant, or something else. I mean, those are some, different equivalents to this, but like, it's like automatic success. It's like if I gave you plus 20 on modifiers in D&D to some of your stats and some of the things that you did in like D&D 5e. Okay, it's like you can't fail in a lot of cases when you're up against something that is not also equivalently a demigod or like some adversary that you would fight there. And so Jared played that for them, and I couldn't stand the game because we were being led by the nose to the next spot. In terms of like story and like combining it with mythos and what Jared had done. This is several years ago. He connected it to like it was because it was the Greek pantheon, so we were all scions of the Greek gods, and we were all, we were effectively going through the different, we've talked about this before, but we were going through the different trials and tribulations. We went through the Minotaur's maze, we fought the Minotaur, like we did all these things that were in the Greek history, but every step was, here is the problem, and now we're going to take you to the dungeon, and now you're at the dungeon, and you're just going to go through and do the dungeon. And they all loved it. I hated it, okay? But they loved it. They ate it up. They thought it was just the coolest thing, because it scratched their itch as players. And I think that, in addition to the story, if there was more motivation to bring the players in a longer story and do more and more, you probably could have gone from that super linear game to something more theme park like, which is usually what we strive for in our games, where you choose the rides, but there's a definitive end to how you get to the end of this here. And I think you have to start at the linear before you can get to the theme park or the sandbox, and it's really important because the linear helps you understand the motivation, how to follow a story, and then the theme park gives you more options that you can suddenly start doing more. I feel like the more that you play the game, it'd be like if you played a video game and it was a semi-open world game, but you didn't do any of the open world stuff. You just followed the storyline and beat the game. And every time you played the game, there's a new storyline. Okay. And you just would repeatedly play the stories over and over and over again. And you never did anything outside the storyline, but you were able to build up a character, spec into things, do all this stuff, just like you're doing here in D&D. And then over time, what you realize is there's a lot of other game that you're not experiencing. And that tends to be the shift, I think, with a new player, which is, okay, well, I love following the story, but I've also wondered what it would be like to do this. Okay. And if you do build in backstories, or you do a little bit of backstory work with them, or a little bit of customization at character creation for any player, you can always bring in that flair even to a super linear story. And that helps then solidify the decisions they made in the character creation that shows that, oh, the GM is listening to me and wants my motivation that I created here to be expressed in the story, and thus they added that little bit to the game itself. Not just spotlight moments, but spotlight like sessions. Like we're really diving into your thing here, and you'd be able to tie those things back in. That little interpersonal weave back into the story is really, really useful, I think, to bring a new player into the game and feel like there's more to this game than linear combat. Tell me the story, get me back into combat. Because that's the goal, is you want them to spread out and do a little bit more. I think it's ambitious, or overly ambitious, to take brand new players and stick them into what you would quote unquote a sandbox game, and then expect them to just run wild and figure things out. I think that is one, it's probably overwhelming to the new players. And then two, and so with it being overwhelming, you might run the risk that it isn't enjoyable to them because they're not doing the thing that they truly want to do, which is, in this case, fight and combat. And then three, you don't know the boundaries to which you can express stuff. I take it for granted that I've done the hobby for, 20 odd years, more than 20 years at this point. And, I've had arguments with my GM. I've had, discussions about rules and trying to manipulate and change rules and be more creative with things. And I think that that's what I don't see when I'm talking about new players or trying to bring a player into the game, or looking at other players who maybe don't have the same desires within a game that I have. But it was just very eye opening and illuminating to kind of hear Lori's uh, thoughts about the game and just what she just wanted from the game in general. And then she's like, I don't know if we can do this. I don't know if we could do that. I don't know if we could do that. I'm like, well, that's a failing on Josh, because what Josh should be doing, and this is really true for all new players, if you're dealing with new players, is you need, if your other players are not guiding them. So let's say it's just one new player at the table. That's one thing versus I got one experienced guy and four other players. You don't want your experienced guy leading the entire party, around. You don't want them to leash everybody and lead them around. If you're the new guy at a table, you also don't want everybody else to rope up the new guy and just drag them around. But also, if you've got a bunch of these new players and your one guy is being considerate, not dragging everybody around, that doesn't mean he's not making choices, because he's your ringer. He knows what to do. They know what to do. She knows what to do. Whoever they are knows what to do. They know when a decision needs to be made and can make that decision definitively. But you need to try to eventually encourage that table talk amongst your players to kind of formulate the plan and start thinking about where they want to go. Okay, well, we know X, we know B, we know all these different things. What do we want to do? Do we want to go arrest the Count? Do we want to, sneak into his mansion? Like, what are we going to do here? That's what I just take that for granted. I think of the plan already. We start discussing the plan at the table. For them, I almost feel like Josh, as their GM, needs to stand up and say, "Hey, I'm gonna try to offer some suggestions," especially if you get crickets after you've given a statement out. And again, the time of the day that they're playing and when they're playing probably isn't the best time for a game slot, but you make do with what you got. So, that aside, you would want to definitely make sure that you're giving the players motivation. I said, Josh, like, help them out. You can suggest things. You could say, well, this and this and this, and do you guys have questions about that? Okay, well, somebody might say, well, I'm thinking about doing this. He said that there's a problem with making decisions around the alignments, and that there is a best and optimal choice, okay, to make in terms of decisions. And if you've ever been a GM, there's no best and optimal choices in the game unless you're giving them hard choices that are definitively going to have the best outcome versus the worst outcome. Typically, all you are trying to do as a GM, and again, new players probably don't know this, is that you're trying to get the players to just make decisions, and then you kind of react in kind to the decisions. It's less about the weight of the decision at the moment. It's more about what you want to do with that decision down the line. And so thus you want the players to make some things, and then you sort of react to those decisions later on or right away. But there's this idea of, best optimal decision and trying to figure out what is the right decision. And he said that that's, something that they struggle with at the table. And so I said, just my suggestion was lead them through the decision-making process. Okay. You don't have to make the decision for them, but you can give them information and you can sort of encourage the discussion at that time to see if maybe people will talk. It's like hitting a pause button in a video game. You can do that in your game. There are no rules in D&D and in any tabletop, that time elapsed in the real world translates to time in game. And so thus, if your players want to go, well, time out, okay, we're going to talk about this, we're going to look at the board, you do it in combat, why, you're not making decisions every 10 seconds in combat. You're trying to look at the most optimal situations as a whole. But it was just, again, what I wanted to say is it was just very interesting talking with her, and I'm very excited to bring her onto the podcast and have discussions with her about things as a new player, and in how maybe she could recommend building up motivations, or maybe what she can recommend to new players and things like that, because again, I hadn't dealt with it. I hadn't sat there at a table looking at it, and I think I think I've played D&D with them one time, and it was through a module, and so they had more context, and Josh is creating his own world here. But it was super eye opening, and I talk about this, and we've talked about this in the podcast. How to improve player interactions, how to get them to feel more motivated. And maybe this can resonate for experienced players too. Maybe you have players who are just very combat driven, and you're trying to get them to branch out a little bit more. I'm not saying you got to completely change, what's working for you. KYP, and know your stories and stuff. But at some point, you as a GM are probably going to want to spread your wings. You're going to want to try some different things. And what your hope is that with talking to your team, with talking with your group, that you're able to kind of try new things, and that the group is receptive and works through them. And so again, I thought it was super illuminating talking with her, and I learned a lot. I feel like I just keep repeating the same thing there, but I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up actually for this week. If you have thoughts on how to kind of bring that new player into the game, if you've dealt with this sort of thing, or dealt with this motivation, or how you have worked new players into finding and developing motivation in the game, Level Up Your Gaming Podcast at gmail.com, or facebook.com/Level Up Your Gaming. I'd love to know. I'd love to hear about it and share that experience with other people. And then also, we are on YouTube, so smash that like button, smash the hell out of it, please. And we appreciate if you review, subscribe, recommend this podcast to a friend. All that stuff helps the podcast grow and continue to grow. And I look forward to giving you more content and great content. Look forward to the new hosts coming onto the show. But that's going to wrap us up for the week. So take care, everyone.